The first thing Naomi Brooks noticed was not the billionaire collapsing into silence, but the way his older sister reached for the pocket watch before he could close his hand around it. Claire Sinclair stopped herself only inches from the cracked silver case, then turned the unfinished gesture into an adjustment of her bracelet. Yet Naomi had already seen the fear beneath her polished expression. Around them, the Sinclair Children's Hope Gala continued beneath crystal chandeliers and orchestral music, although Ethan Sinclair appeared to hear none of it as he studied the inscription hidden inside the watch. Naomi had been told he was cold, calculating, and nearly impossible to surprise, but the man standing before her looked less like a powerful healthcare executive than a son confronting a voice he had buried 20 years earlier. Her grandfather had given her only one instruction before she left his home that evening: place the watch directly into Ethan's hands and trust no one who tried to take it first. Naomi had assumed Samuel was being overly cautious, until Claire's fingers moved toward the watch and Ethan asked, in a voice stripped of every trace of authority, where her grandfather had found something that should have been destroyed with his father. Ethan led Naomi into a private conference room overlooking the Chicago River, while Claire followed with the composed urgency of someone determined to remain present during a conversation she had not expected. He placed the watch beneath the table lamp, opened the engraved cover, and traced the words his father had repeated throughout his childhood. Time measures success, but character measures a life. William Sinclair's automobile had left an icy county road 19 years earlier, struck a concrete barrier, and burned before emergency crews could reach him, leaving investigators with little more than official conclusions and a family forced to accept them. The watch had been listed among William's missing belongings, although Ethan remembered his Uncle Richard insisting that the fire had probably destroyed anything not recovered at the scene. Naomi explained that Samuel had kept the watch inside a locked drawer after receiving it from a frightened man who arrived at his house 2 days after the accident. Before Ethan could ask the man's name, Naomi unfolded the weathered leather pouch that had protected the watch and revealed a note written in faded blue ink. Ethan recognized Harold Mercer's handwriting immediately, because Harold had been William's closest friend, the director of his charitable foundation, and the first person to disappear after Richard took control of the company. The note contained only 12 words, yet they changed the room more completely than any accusation could have done. If William's son comes seeking truth, tell him I failed to keep my promise. Claire read the sentence twice before insisting that grief often made people attach meaning to ordinary objects, especially when decades had passed and reliable memories had weakened. Naomi did not argue, because she had spent enough time among wealthy donors to recognize resistance disguised as reason. But Ethan quietly asked why Claire had tried to take the watch before he examined it. His sister's face tightened, and for one brief moment, the practiced confidence of a Sinclair disappeared beneath something closer to shame. Claire admitted that she had seen the watch once after their father's death, not at the accident scene or inside a police evidence bag, but on Richard Sinclair's desk during a closed meeting with Harold Mercer. She had been 24, overwhelmed by funeral arrangements and corporate lawyers, and Richard had told her the object was merely a damaged company award that would be discarded. Ethan stared at her, with an anger made more dangerous by how carefully he controlled it, while Naomi realized the evening's mystery had already become a family betrayal. Claire explained that she had remained silent because Richard became their legal guardian in everything but name after William's death, protecting the company while Ethan completed college and she struggled through their mother's declining health. He had taught them that survival required discipline, discretion, and loyalty, then persuaded them that questioning him would endanger thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended upon a stable transition. Ethan listened without interrupting, although the distance growing between them felt larger than the river beyond the windows. Naomi finally said that Samuel had kept something else, but he refused to release it until Ethan came to his home without attorneys, publicists, or anyone representing Sinclair Healthcare. Ethan agreed immediately, while Claire warned that acting on an old man's fears could expose the family to scandal and place Samuel in danger if someone else had been watching the past more carefully than they realized. Her warning sounded less like manipulation than knowledge, and Ethan asked what she was still withholding. Claire answered only that Richard had telephoned her 3 days earlier, before Naomi had entered the gala, asking whether Samuel Brooks had contacted anyone in the family. That single fact eliminated coincidence, because Naomi had told no one outside her grandfather's home why she was attending the gala. Ethan ordered his security director to preserve every camera recording from the building, then instructed his assistant to retrieve the original accident report and all archive access logs connected to William Sinclair's foundation. Claire urged him not to make formal requests through company systems, explaining that Richard retained influence among senior administrators and would learn about the search within minutes. Ethan looked toward Naomi, perhaps measuring whether a stranger deserved the trust his own family had damaged, then removed his telephone battery and placed the device face down on the table. He asked whether Samuel would still receive them that night, because any delay now belonged to the person who already knew they were asking questions. Naomi called her grandfather from a secure line, and Samuel answered before the first ring had finished, as though he had been sitting beside the telephone for 19 years. He told her to bring Ethan alone, then added one sentence that made Claire close her eyes before Naomi repeated it aloud. "Tell William's son that Grace has finally run out of time." They left the gala through a service corridor, while music and applause continued behind them, preserving the appearance of an ordinary charitable evening for guests who would never know what had shifted upstairs. Ethan dismissed his driver and entered Naomi's aging sedan without complaint, although the vehicle's cracked dashboard and unreliable heater placed him inside a world far removed from polished boardrooms. During the drive toward Chicago's South Side, Naomi asked who Grace was, and Ethan admitted he had never heard the name within his family, the company, or his father's published history. Claire, who had insisted on following in a separate car, remained several blocks behind until a black sport utility vehicle turned from Lakeshore Drive and matched Naomi's speed through every intersection. Ethan noticed it first, then instructed Naomi not to accelerate or acknowledge the driver, because fear would reveal that they understood they were being followed. As the black vehicle drew closer, Samuel called again and whispered that someone had entered his backyard. The line went silent before Naomi could answer, leaving Ethan with the watch clenched inside his hand and Naomi racing toward a house where the past might already be waiting for them. Naomi reached her grandfather's street without stopping at the final intersection, and Ethan braced one hand against the dashboard as her sedan turned hard enough to scatter loose gravel beneath its tires. Samuel's porch light remained on, but the front door stood open several inches, while the black vehicle that had followed them slowed at the corner and continued past without revealing its occupants. Ethan asked Naomi to remain inside, yet she reminded him that Samuel was her family and moved before he could mistake concern for authority. They entered together and found the living room undisturbed, the photographs straight, the lamps glowing, and Samuel seated calmly at the kitchen table, with a baseball bat resting across his knees. The intruder had fled through the rear gate after Samuel activated an old motion alarm, but not before searching the cedar cabinet where he had stored William's property. Nothing appeared missing, although a blue wax envelope had been removed from its hiding place and left on the floor, as though whoever entered had found it but lacked time to break the seal. Samuel studied Ethan for several moments before offering coffee, because dignity mattered to him more than allowing wealthy visitors to define the pace inside his home. Ethan accepted, removed his jacket, and sat across from the older man without an attorney, assistant, or recording device, exactly as Samuel had requested. On the wall behind him hung a photograph of William Sinclair and Samuel at the construction site of a neighborhood clinic, both wearing inexpensive helmets and laughing beside volunteers who had never appeared in the company's official history. Samuel explained that William had spent nearly a decade quietly funding community programs while publicly allowing Sinclair Healthcare to receive credit, because he believed useful work mattered more than ownership of the praise. Harold Mercer managed those partnerships, while Grace Holloway served as an independent community advocate who reviewed every project and challenged William whenever corporate decisions ignored local needs. She accepted no salary, held no formal title, and left almost no administrative trail, because independence allowed her to oppose the Sinclair family without fearing dismissal. 3 months before William's death, Grace discovered that money assigned to neighborhood clinics had been redirected through consulting firms linked to Charles Benton, the foundation's accounting director. The transfers were carefully disguised as compliance expenses, construction assessments, and legal services, yet several recipient companies shared addresses with an investment business controlled by Richard Sinclair. William refused to accuse his brother without proof, so he authorized Harold to prepare an independent audit and asked Samuel to secure testimony from community organizations whose funding had disappeared. The four of them planned to meet at Union Station the morning after William's accident, where Grace would deliver copies of the financial records to an outside nonprofit watchdog. William never arrived, Harold vanished, and Grace concluded that at least one member of the Sinclair organization had known about the meeting. She delivered the watch and sealed envelope to Samuel, then disappeared before anyone could trace the evidence through him. Samuel had attempted to contact Claire and Ethan repeatedly, but every letter was returned, every call intercepted by Richard's office, and one investigator warned him that continuing could bring unwanted attention to Naomi's family. Ethan asked why Samuel had waited until now, and the answer wounded him more deeply than any accusation against Richard. Samuel said he had watched Ethan rise through the company while hospitals expanded, executive compensation increased, and several charitable programs quietly lost funding, but he could not tell whether William's son had inherited his father's conscience or merely his name. Grace had insisted that evidence should never be placed into the hands of a man who valued power more than truth, because such a man would use it to remove a rival rather than repair the harm. She had attended public events over the years, observing how Ethan treated nurses, custodians, patients, and volunteers when cameras were focused elsewhere. At the gala, he had thanked a teenage scholarship recipient by name before greeting the donors who financed the evening, and Grace believed that small choice proved more than any public speech. Naomi remembered seeing an older woman in a wide-brimmed hat near the volunteer entrance, although she had assumed the woman belonged to a neighborhood organization arriving late. Samuel slid the sealed envelope across the table, but prevented Ethan from opening it, because William's handwritten instruction required Grace to be present. Ethan argued that someone had just broken into the house and Grace might be in immediate danger, yet Samuel insisted that the condition protected more than tradition. Inside the envelope was a location known only to Grace, Samuel, and the person William had chosen as an independent witness, and opening it without Grace would make the evidence legally vulnerable if Richard claimed manipulation. Ethan asked whether Grace was still alive, and Samuel admitted she had contacted him 8 months earlier after discovering someone had accessed archived Foundation records. She believed Richard was searching for the identity of William's final witness, whose testimony could connect the financial theft to actions taken before the accident. Grace had concealed the name on a copy of the Union Station reservation herself, hoping to misdirect anyone who found it. But she later learned someone else had covered the name again with modern ink. That meant Richard, or his associates, had located the document and were now close to identifying the witness. Claire arrived moments later, carrying a company archive file she had removed before Richard's staff could block her access. Inside was the original transfer log from William's office, showing 6 boxes moved after his death, although only 5 entered permanent storage. Richard had personally signed for the missing box, and Claire admitted she had witnessed him burn documents in the estate fireplace during the week after the funeral. She had convinced herself he was destroying private medical information, because accepting another explanation would have required confronting the man holding their family together. Samuel did not condemn her, but he asked how many years fear should be allowed to disguise itself as loyalty before becoming complicity. Claire accepted the question without defending herself, then handed Ethan a confidential board notice announcing an emergency vote scheduled 48 hours later. Richard intended to remove Ethan as chief executive, citing unstable judgment, unauthorized archive access, and conduct threatening the company's reputation. Ethan understood that Richard was no longer protecting an old secret. He was controlling the timetable, forcing them to choose between the investigation and Ethan's position before they could secure decisive proof. Naomi expected Ethan to retreat into legal strategy, but he surprised everyone by asking Samuel, Which neighborhood programs had lost the most money after William's death? Samuel named a children's clinic that had closed, an affordable housing project abandoned halfway through construction, and a scholarship fund reduced until only wealthy applicants with influential sponsors received support. Ethan's expression changed as he realized the corruption had not remained on paper. It had shaped who received treatment, who kept a home, and which children were told opportunity did not belong to them. Before anyone could decide their next move, a stone shattered the kitchen window and struck the far wall, carrying a folded message secured by black tape. Naomi opened it carefully and found a recent photograph of Grace leaving the Sinclair archive, with a warning written beneath her image: "Withdraw from the board meeting, or the old woman will not survive long enough to open William's envelope." Ethan read the threat without allowing anger to dictate his voice, although Naomi saw his fingers tighten until the edges of the photograph bent beneath his grip. Calling the police would create an official record, but Claire warned that Richard maintained long-standing relationships with senior officials through hospital contracts and charitable donations, making any premature report likely to reach him before investigators acted. Marcus Hale arrived within 20 minutes after Ethan contacted him through a prepaid telephone, and his first recommendation was not retaliation but preservation. He photographed the broken window, secured the stone and message inside evidence bags, recorded statements from everyone present, and arranged independent forensic testing through a retired federal examiner with no connection to Sinclair Healthcare. Marcus then explained the choice Richard had designed. Ethan could protect his position by abandoning Grace, or pursue Grace and allow Richard to portray him as reckless before the board. Naomi quietly answered that a choice created by a dishonest man did not become honorable merely because both options carried consequences. Samuel recognized the building behind Grace in the photograph as the West Haven Community Resource Center, where she and William had developed their earliest neighborhood partnerships. Ethan wanted to send private security, but Naomi argued that unfamiliar guards would frighten volunteers and alert anyone watching the center. She had worked there several times through a literacy program and could enter without appearing connected to the Sinclair investigation, while Ethan's presence would attract immediate attention. He objected because the threat named Grace and proved someone was already observing Naomi's family. Yet Naomi reminded him that she had delivered the watch because her grandfather trusted her judgment, not because she needed a billionaire to replace it. Ethan apologized without qualification, then agreed to follow her plan as long as Marcus tracked every movement and Claire remained with Samuel. The exchange marked the first moment Naomi saw him surrender control, without interpreting cooperation as weakness, perhaps because the investigation had begun teaching him what William understood years earlier. The resource center occupied a weathered brick building surrounded by basketball courts, family homes, and vacant lots transformed into summer gardens. Naomi entered through the kitchen, while volunteers prepared meals for elderly residents, and the director greeted her with genuine warmth before noticing Ethan waiting near the hallway in an ordinary coat. When Naomi mentioned Grace Holloway, the woman did not appear surprised, but she refused to discuss her until Ethan answered a question William had once asked every prospective partner. She wanted to know whether he believed charity existed to rescue powerless people or to return power that institutions had taken from them. Ethan considered the difference before saying that his company had spent years celebrating what it gave, while rarely asking what communities had been prevented from controlling for themselves. The director studied him carefully, then unlocked a small office that preserved the center's earliest records and revealed that Grace had visited 8 months earlier with a younger volunteer whose name she had not recorded. Inside the office stood an oak bookshelf containing binders filled with meeting minutes, handwritten budgets, and letters from families who had received medical care through William's projects. Naomi found no dramatic financial ledger, only evidence of lives affected by decisions that corporate reports had reduced to numbers, including a mother who kept her apartment during cancer treatment and a boy who became a physician after receiving William's scholarship. Ethan read quietly until his father ceased being a symbol and became a man whose unfinished promises carried names, addresses, and consequences. Behind the final binder, Naomi discovered a narrow wooden box wrapped in plain paper, but the package contained journals rather than proof of theft. William had documented disagreements with Richard, concerns about Benton's accounting practices, and his fear that Sinclair Healthcare would eventually mistake growth for purpose. One entry described Claire as brave but vulnerable to responsibility, while another described Ethan as observant enough to recognize injustice but young enough to believe adults always corrected it. A memorandum folded inside the journal confirmed that William authorized an independent audit before his death, with Harold Mercer responsible for delivering records to an outside nonprofit organization. Marcus explained that the document established intent and contradicted Richard's claim that no concerns existed, but it could not prove who redirected the money or whether William's death involved criminal conduct. Naomi then noticed several pages had been removed cleanly from the journal, leaving thin fibers near the binding and a partial impression pressed into the next sheet. Using angled light from Marcus's telephone, they recovered fragments of an address and the words Lake County Trust. The director recognized the address as an abandoned savings bank converted into private document storage during the 1990s. Grace had visited the center shortly before going there, 8 months earlier, accompanied by a woman Naomi could not remember meeting, although security footage from that afternoon might still exist on an older backup system. The footage revealed Naomi herself entering beside Grace, just as the visitor registration book later confirmed, yet Naomi's confusion remained genuine rather than theatrical. She remembered volunteering that afternoon and speaking with an older woman who introduced herself as Helen, but nothing about the encounter had seemed important. The woman asked Naomi why she continued community work despite receiving little recognition, and Naomi replied that dignity was not a performance requiring an audience. Grace had apparently tested her character just as she had tested Ethan's, choosing anonymity so their responses would remain honest. Before leaving the center, Grace asked Naomi to place a sealed records request into the outgoing mail, addressed to Lake County Trust under the name Helen Grant. Naomi had done so without examining it, believing she was assisting an elderly volunteer with a routine task. Marcus now understood that the request likely activated access to a secure deposit Grace could not retrieve personally, without exposing her identity. They drove to the former bank, where a private records company operated behind restored stone walls and modern security doors. The manager initially denied any account connected to Grace Holloway, Helen Grant, William Sinclair, or Harold Mercer. But Naomi remembered the oak leaf pendant Grace had worn in old photographs and noticed the same symbol etched into the corner of William's memorandum. When Marcus presented the symbol, the manager retrieved a handwritten trust register created before the facility digitized its accounts. A sealed deposit had been established by William Sinclair for an unnamed community trustee, accessible only when 2 independent witnesses presented matching oak leaf pendants and answered a recorded question. Samuel possessed one pendant that had belonged to his wife Evelyn, while Grace retained the other. The arrangement proved Grace was alive when the trust was created, but did not reveal her location, leaving them dependent upon finding her before Richard did. As they stepped outside, Claire called from Samuel's house and said Richard had arrived alone, requesting a private conversation before the board vote. Ethan instructed her not to let him enter, but Samuel had already opened the door because he believed truth should not require hiding behind locks. Through Claire's telephone, they heard Richard tell Samuel that Grace had misunderstood William. Harold had stolen foundation money, and Ethan would destroy the company if allowed to continue. Samuel asked why an innocent man needed to threaten an elderly woman, and Richard answered that he had made no threat, although his certainty revealed he knew about a message never disclosed publicly. The call ended abruptly, followed by a sound of furniture striking the floor. Ethan turned toward the car, but Marcus stopped him long enough to reveal an incoming security alert from the records facility. Someone inside had just accessed the William Sinclair Trust using Grace Holloway's pendant, while the 3 people carrying Samuel's matching pendant were standing together on the sidewalk. The records manager locked the facility before Ethan could reach the entrance, then explained through the glass that emergency protocol required everyone to remain outside until internal security identified the unauthorized visitor. Marcus demanded that the account be frozen, but the manager replied that the trust's original terms allowed either pendant holder to retrieve one designated item without the second witness if an immediate threat existed. William had created that exception to protect the evidence, yet someone who possessed Grace's pendant could now use the same protection to remove it. Naomi circled toward the loading area and saw a woman in a gray coat leaving through a side door with a document case secured beneath her arm. Ethan started after her, but Naomi recognized the deliberate unevenness of the woman's steps from the community center footage and shouted Grace's name. The woman stopped beneath the cold afternoon light, removed her hat, and revealed a face older than the photographs but unmistakably composed, while two security guards moved protectively behind her. Grace had arranged the access alert herself after receiving Samuel's message that the watch had reached Ethan, because she needed to know whether Richard's people were monitoring the trust. She had allowed the system to expose her location, confident that anyone responding too quickly would reveal access to information they should not possess. No stranger appeared, but within minutes, Marcus received notice that Richard's attorneys had filed an emergency request to inspect the trust records, proving his team had been watching archived legal channels. Grace refused to open the document case in public, and they relocated to a private room inside the facility where every surface could be recorded and every transfer independently witnessed. She greeted Ethan without affection or apology, explaining that William had trusted the man his son might become, while she had trusted only what Ethan repeatedly chose when reputation offered him easier alternatives. Ethan accepted the judgment because he had spent years believing leadership meant being evaluated by results, not by how conveniently he avoided uncomfortable truths. Grace's case contained copies of Foundation ledgers, Benton's transfer instructions, correspondence with shell companies, and a signed affidavit from Harold Mercer, recorded shortly before he disappeared. Harold admitted that Richard and Benton had redirected money through consulting contracts, but he also confessed to approving several transactions after Richard threatened to expose his private debts and destroy his family. When William discovered the scheme, Harold agreed to cooperate with the independent audit, yet panic overcame him after the accident, and he fled instead of meeting Grace at Union Station. He entrusted the watch and note to Samuel, then entered federal witness negotiations that collapsed when investigators concluded the financial evidence was insufficient and the accident appeared unrelated. Grace later learned Harold had died abroad under his legal name, leaving his affidavit as both confession and warning. The evidence proved theft and obstruction, but it still did not establish that Richard caused William's accident. William's sealed envelope contained the missing connection, although Grace insisted Samuel and Claire must be present before it could be opened. Ethan called Claire again and learned she and Samuel were safe. The earlier crash had been Samuel knocking over a chair while blocking Richard from entering the cedar cabinet. Richard had departed after warning that the board would choose stability over sentiment, leaving Claire shaken by how little remorse he displayed. They reconvened at Marcus's office, where independent cameras documented the envelope's condition before Grace and Samuel broke the blue wax together. Inside was a letter from William, a key to a Union Station locker that no longer existed, and a compact audio cassette labeled with a date 3 days before the accident. William's letter stated that if he failed to attend the scheduled meeting, Grace should retrieve the locker's contents with the unnamed witness and deliver them to federal authorities. The witness's identity had been omitted from the letter because William feared any document carrying the name would place that person in danger. The cassette contained a conversation between William and Richard, recorded inside William's automobile, apparently after William discovered a tracking device beneath the dashboard and began documenting private encounters. Richard did not confess to planning violence, but he demanded that William cancel the audit, accusing him of endangering the company over money already distributed through arrangements benefiting family interests. William answered that stolen money remained stolen even when respectable people spent it, especially when children lost medical treatment so executives could protect influence. Richard warned that exposing the transfers would collapse investor confidence, remove William from leadership, and leave Ethan and Claire carrying the shame. William replied that his children would inherit consequences either way, but he preferred they inherit the truth rather than prosperity financed by silence. The recording ended after Richard said William should be careful driving rural roads alone, because accidents happened when powerful men ignored warnings. The statement created suspicion, but not legal proof, and Ethan recognized that confronting Richard with incomplete evidence might allow him to dismiss the recording as an angry family dispute. Grace then revealed why William's final witness mattered. The person had inspected his vehicle on the morning before the crash and discovered that a brake line had been deliberately weakened. William postponed repairs because he intended to deliver the automobile directly to investigators after the Union Station meeting, hoping the tampering would establish the danger surrounding the financial case. Instead, Richard persuaded him to attend an emergency hospital meeting that evening, forcing William onto the road earlier than expected. The witness followed but lost sight of him during freezing rain, then reached the scene after another vehicle had already stopped nearby. Samuel found the watch beyond the official perimeter days later, proving someone moved William's belongings after the crash. Claire began crying before Grace spoke the witness's name because she already understood from details no one else recognized. Their mother, Margaret Sinclair, had inspected the vehicle. Before marrying William, she had studied mechanical engineering and continued restoring vintage automobiles privately, although Richard often mocked the interest as inappropriate for the wife of a prominent executive. Margaret saw the damaged line, warned William, and later followed him toward the hospital, but Richard convinced her after the crash that revealing the inspection would make police suspect William had knowingly driven an unsafe vehicle. He threatened to accuse her of negligence, take control of the children, and destroy the foundation, while the family fought publicly. Margaret signed a confidential statement that Richard locked inside the Union Station locker, then spent the remaining years of her life believing her silence protected Ethan and Claire. Grace had watched over her from a distance, waiting for Margaret to become strong enough to testify, but illness took that opportunity away. Claire admitted their mother had tried to discuss the accident shortly before her death, yet Claire postponed the conversation because she was exhausted and assumed grief had confused her. The guilt threatened to overwhelm her until Naomi reminded her that Richard had spent years converting fear into obedience, making each family member believe silence was their private failure rather than his system of control. Grace handed Claire a final sealed statement Margaret had given her during their last meeting, explaining that William's locker had been emptied before Grace arrived, but Margaret secretly recovered one item Richard overlooked. Inside the statement, Margaret described seeing Richard's sedan near the crash site before emergency vehicles arrived, with Charles Benton standing beside William's damaged car. She could not prove they caused the crash, but she saw Benton remove William's briefcase, while Richard searched the roadside. At the bottom, Margaret wrote that she had hidden the briefcase where Richard would never look, inside the house belonging to the daughter he consistently underestimated. Claire lifted her head slowly, realizing the evidence had remained beneath her own roof for almost 2 decades. Claire's home had undergone 3 renovations since Margaret's final visit, yet one room remained almost untouched because Claire had never found the courage to change it. The small upstairs sitting room had belonged to her mother, filled with gardening books, sewing baskets, and an antique writing desk Richard once dismissed as worthless. Margaret's statement mentioned the daughter he underestimated, but offered no location beyond a reference to courage being hidden beneath the work women were told did not matter. Naomi examined the desk, while Claire searched drawers she had opened hundreds of times without understanding what she was meant to see. Beneath the removable tray of sewing supplies, Naomi discovered a false wooden panel, secured by a latch shaped like an oak leaf. The compartment contained William's weather-damaged briefcase, wrapped inside one of Margaret's unfinished quilts and preserved with packets designed to absorb moisture. Marcus documented every step before opening it, because evidence surviving 19 years could become useless if mishandled during a moment of excitement. Inside were original financial ledgers, correspondence connecting Benton's shell companies to Richard's investment firm, photographs of the damaged brake line, and a portable recorder containing William's final message. He explained that the vehicle tampering might have been intended only as intimidation, but he feared Richard had become desperate after learning the audit would expose millions diverted from community programs. William stated that he was driving to meet Margaret at the hospital rather than waiting for the Union Station meeting, because Richard claimed Ethan had been injured during a college event and urgently needed him. Ethan remembered no accident that night, confirming the emergency had been invented to place William on the road. The message ended while William was still driving, moments after he noticed Richard's sedan following through the freezing rain. Ethan wanted immediate criminal action, but Marcus warned that the recordings, ledgers, and Margaret's statement required authentication before prosecutors could rely upon them. Richard's board meeting would begin in less than 3 hours, and failing to appear would allow him to remove Ethan without opposition, seize company systems, and potentially destroy remaining records. Grace proposed releasing everything publicly, but Naomi argued that transforming the evidence into a spectacle before verification could make the truth appear like a desperate corporate feud. Richard had spent decades presenting himself as the family's stabilizing force. He would exploit any emotional mistake and persuade employees that Ethan was sacrificing them to avenge his father. The stronger path required Ethan to enter the meeting without revealing all the evidence, force Richard to make claims under recorded conditions, and allow his own certainty to expose contradictions. Claire would attend as a voting shareholder and confront the history she had spent years avoiding. The boardroom occupied the top floor of Sinclair Healthcare headquarters, overlooking a city filled with hospitals, clinics, and neighborhoods shaped by decisions made inside that polished room. Richard sat at the head of the table before Ethan arrived, surrounded by attorneys, senior directors, and executives who had already received a carefully prepared narrative about their chief executive's instability. He described Ethan's search as an emotional obsession triggered by a stranger carrying a stolen family object, then accused Naomi's grandfather of exploiting grief for financial benefit. Ethan did not defend himself immediately, because reacting to every insult would allow Richard to control the structure of the conversation. He asked only whether Richard had accessed Williams Foundation archives 8 months earlier, and Richard answered that he had reviewed historical materials for an anniversary publication. When Ethan asked whether he altered the Union Station reservation, Richard denied knowing the document existed. Marcus then displayed the archive request bearing Richard's signature, followed by forensic proof showing the final participant's name had been concealed during the same access period. Richard blamed Eleanor Pierce, claiming retired employees often made unauthorized corrections, but Claire revealed that Eleanor had already provided a sworn statement describing Richard's instructions. Several board members shifted uneasily, although Richard maintained control by arguing that archival irregularities had nothing to do with Ethan's present fitness to lead. He reminded them that exposing decades-old allegations could destabilize hospital financing, trigger lawsuits, and threaten employees who bore no responsibility for Williams' disputes. The argument was powerful because it contained a real risk, and Ethan understood why fear had protected Richard for so long. He answered that stability built upon concealed theft was not stability, but deferred harm passed quietly to people with less power. Richard demanded proof of theft, expecting Ethan either to reveal unauthenticated evidence or admit he possessed none. Instead, Ethan presented verified records showing current foundation payments still flowing to a Benton-controlled consulting company, proving the scheme had continued under modern accounting systems. Naomi and Grace had discovered the active transfers by comparing Williams' original community budgets with publicly reported expenses, while Marcus's forensic team traced the money through organizations sharing officers and addresses. The revelation converted an old family mystery into present corporate misconduct, giving the board immediate authority to suspend payments and authorize an independent audit. Richard's confidence finally broke, not because the past had returned, but because Ethan had prevented him from isolating it there. He accused Grace of manipulating William, Harold of stealing records, Samuel of hiding evidence, Claire of weakness, and Ethan of betraying the family for a woman he had known only days. Naomi remained silent until Richard pointed toward her and described community advocates as people who understood outrage better than responsibility. She answered that responsibility was precisely why families had survived after promised clinics closed, scholarships vanished, and housing projects remained unfinished. Richard had treated those losses as accounting adjustments because he never had to sit beside a mother choosing between medicine and rent, while Samuel and Grace spent years helping people absorb consequences created by men protected from them. Her words did not accuse him of murder or claim what evidence had not yet proved. They simply returned the discussion to the human cost he repeatedly ignored. Several directors asked for an immediate recess, but Richard refused and called for the removal vote before Ethan's accusations could create further confusion. Claire possessed enough family shares to determine the outcome, and Richard looked toward her with the confidence of a man who had trained someone's fear so thoroughly that he mistook it for permanent loyalty. He reminded her privately, though the room's microphones remained active, that their mother had chosen silence and expected her daughter to protect what remained. Claire answered that Margaret had not chosen silence freely. Richard had constructed a prison from grief, legal threats, and responsibility for two frightened children. She voted against Ethan's removal and requested Richard's immediate suspension pending investigation, while 3 independent directors joined her after reviewing the current financial transfers. The motion passed by a single vote, leaving Richard without authority for the first time since William's death. As security approached, Richard did not plead or apologize. He looked at Ethan and said that removing him would not restore the money, reopen the clinics, or return their father. Ethan replied that justice could not restore the past, but it could stop demanding that innocent people continue paying for it. Richard was escorted from the boardroom while federal investigators, contacted by Marcus after authentication of the active transfers, waited downstairs with warrants for company records and Benton's financial offices. The board's decision protected the evidence, but the deeper question remained unresolved, because no document directly proved Richard ordered the brake tampering or intended William to die. Before leaving, Richard turned toward Claire and said Margaret's statement would destroy her children's memory of their mother once the full truth emerged. Claire understood the threat only after Marcus opened the final compartment in William's briefcase and discovered a second recording labeled with her own name. The recording had been made by Margaret Sinclair 6 months before her death, when illness had weakened her body, but finally loosened the fear Richard had placed around her voice. She admitted that William told her about the damaged brake line, yet she did more than inspect the vehicle and follow him toward the hospital. After Richard invented the story about Ethan's injury, Margaret telephoned the college and confirmed her son was safe, then tried repeatedly to warn William before he left the city. When she reached him through the automobile's hands-free telephone, William said Richard was following and asked her to contact police. But Margaret hesitated because Richard had already threatened to expose private information about Claire's treatment for severe depression after college. He claimed public scandal would destroy Claire's future and promised William would return safely if Margaret remained silent. By the time she understood that compliance offered no protection, the crash had already occurred. Margaret followed Richard's sedan to the scene and saw Benton remove the briefcase while Richard searched for William's watch and telephone. She confronted them, but Richard claimed William had lost control on the ice before they arrived and insisted that removing the records protected Ethan and Claire from corporate collapse. Margaret recovered the briefcase from Benton's office days later with help from Grace, then concealed it inside Claire's home because Richard never entered rooms associated with domestic work. Her recording did not prove he cut the brake line, although it established that he created the false emergency, followed William, removed evidence, obstructed the investigation, threatened witnesses, and benefited from the concealed financial scheme. She ended by apologizing to her children, not for loving them too little, but for allowing fear to convince her that protecting them required surrendering the truth. Claire listened without hiding her tears, while Ethan placed his hand beside hers, rather than offering forgiveness she had not requested. Over the following months, federal investigators authenticated the recordings, reconstructed the financial transfers, and obtained Benton's cooperation after presenting evidence of ongoing fraud. Benton admitted hiring a mechanic to damage William's brake line under Richard's instruction, believing the purpose was to frighten William into canceling the audit. Richard then created the false emergency, knowing William would drive before repairs were completed, but Benton insisted neither man explicitly discussed causing his death. Prosecutors charged Richard with conspiracy, financial fraud, evidence obstruction, witness intimidation, and conduct contributing to Williams' fatal crash, while acknowledging that the precise degree of intent would be decided through the legal process rather than public speculation. The distinction mattered to Ethan because truth lost its value when people exaggerated it merely to satisfy anger. Justice did not require transforming uncertainty into certainty. It required proving what could be proved and refusing to conceal the rest. Ethan resigned temporarily as chief executive while the board completed an independent investigation, surprising directors who expected him to use Richard's removal as an opportunity to consolidate power. He argued that leadership could not demand accountability from others while exempting itself from scrutiny, especially after benefiting from systems shaped by concealed wrongdoing. Claire joined the oversight committee but declined the chairmanship, choosing instead to work with mental health organizations, supporting families manipulated through shame and secrecy. Grace returned to public community work under her real name, though she rejected every invitation to become the symbolic hero of the scandal. Samuel reminded reporters that no single person had preserved Williams' promise. It survived because ordinary people carried different pieces when institutions failed to protect the whole. Naomi accepted no corporate position, despite Ethan offering her authority over community partnerships, because she believed independence remained essential when powerful organizations attempted to improve themselves. Instead, she established a council composed of nurses, patients, teachers, neighborhood leaders, and former scholarship recipients, with legal control over a restored charitable trust funded by recovered assets and executive compensation reductions. Ethan agreed that Sinclair Healthcare would provide resources without controlling every decision, replacing the language of rescue with shared authority. The first reopened project was not a glamorous hospital wing bearing Williams' name, but the children's clinic that had closed after funds disappeared. Families helped design its services, local organizations selected its leadership, and the building carried no billionaire's portrait in the lobby. One evening, several months after construction began, Naomi found Ethan sitting alone on the clinic's unfinished steps with his father's repaired pocket watch resting in his palm. The hands moved again, although the crack in the crystal remained because Ethan had asked the watchmaker not to erase every mark left by its history. He admitted that he had spent years believing his father's legacy was a standard he could never reach, when the truth was less flattering and more useful. William had been courageous, but he had also delayed confronting Richard, underestimated the danger surrounding the audit, and left too much responsibility scattered among frightened people. Naomi said worthwhile legacies were not instructions delivered by perfect ancestors. They were unfinished choices passed to imperfect descendants. Ethan smiled and asked whether Grace had taught her that, but Naomi answered that life had taught it more convincingly than any person could. Their relationship developed without the sudden declarations common to stories that confused shared danger with permanent intimacy. Ethan learned that Naomi's refusal to be impressed was not hostility, while Naomi discovered that his restraint often concealed uncertainty rather than arrogance. They disagreed about budgets, public statements, and whether repaired institutions deserved trust before proving themselves, yet neither used affection to silence the other. When Ethan eventually returned as chief executive after an independent vote, he accepted a governance agreement limiting family control and granting employees and community representatives permanent board seats. The decision reduced his personal authority, but for the first time he understood that leadership became stronger when it no longer depended upon one supposedly exceptional person. Richard was convicted on the financial and obstruction charges, then entered a plea on the remaining counts after Benton's testimony and Margaret's recording made continued denial impossible. During sentencing, he claimed every decision had been made to protect the company William built, but the judge answered that institutions were not protected when human beings were sacrificed to preserve their image. Ethan did not celebrate the sentence, because punishment could not recover lost years or erase his family's participation in silence. He visited Richard once, not to forgive him prematurely, but to say that the Sinclair name would no longer be used as an excuse for what its members feared losing. Richard asked whether Ethan believed William would be proud, and Ethan answered that he had stopped building his life around approval from the dead. At the clinic's opening, Samuel stood beside Grace, Claire, Naomi, and dozens of residents whose names now appeared in the governing charter, rather than only in ceremonial speeches. Ethan spoke briefly, thanking the people who had preserved evidence, challenged power, admitted failure, and continued serving communities after promised support disappeared. He did not describe his father as a flawless visionary. He described him as a man who understood too late that good intentions required transparent systems and courageous partners. Naomi watched children enter the bright waiting room, carrying books and winter coats, while nurses welcomed families who once traveled miles for basic care. The repaired pocket watch rested inside a glass case near the entrance, beside William's original sentence and a second line chosen by the community council. Time could reveal what power tried to bury, but character was measured by what people repaired after the truth returned.